So Terry, it's a great time to be buying right now, as we've talked about, and it's quite unique with what we're seeing, not just here in Australia, but I sent you that article that the other day. Even in the US, we're seeing big growth at the moment, although we only focus on Australia. But why is there so much growth going on in the property market, and is it a good time to be getting into the market right now? Well, since we've already had good growth, should we?
I think you've got to say, is there a bad time to get into the market?
I think the best time to get into the market is when you're ready to go. When you've got all your ducks in line, you're ready to go. The people who try to time the market usually end up, or quite often they end up doing nothing ever, because they're always waiting for something to happen. They're the procrastinators that just can't seem to get off their butts and take action. But I think, yes, now is a good time to get into market, even though it's in some cases frenetic and it's quite difficult to be a buyer in the market, because the people who say, no, I'm going to wait until it settles down, 2 years' time when it settles down, they're going to be paying maybe 100 grand more for the same property. And so...
Hey, wasn't property supposed to drop by 40% last year?
It was, indeed. It was forecast by the gaggle of chattering economists that's out there.
Who've been saying that every year. Every time.
15 months ago, 15%, 20% drop. Some said 30%. But even as I noticed, the National Australia Bank this week published their new forecast. They revise their forecast 3 times a year, which tends to render their previous forecast redundant. But 4 months ago, they were predicting maybe 6% growth. And now 4 months later, they're now predicting what's actually happened, which is more like 20% growth. But the banks and economists generally just never get it right, because it's not really their area of specialty and they don't understand the dynamics. And right now, this market has been created by a series of multiple influences, but some of them are unique. Some of them are influences we haven't seen before, and I think it's probably why the non-specialists like the economists are struggling to get their heads around it and understand why it's as strong as it is.
And it's interesting, they often look at the market as a whole, not understand there are markets within markets. And even in areas like places like Gympie, for example, there are even markets within the Gympie market that will outperform other markets. And then the type of properties that also have those influences and stuff like that, where we see that uplift and that growth.
I mean, there were some dire predictions once the COVID came out, about property crashing and all that sort of stuff, but it's just gone completely opposite.
Yeah, and again, they didn't really understand. No. I mean, you could argue that the boom we're having has happened because of the pandemic, not despite the pandemic, because the pandemic has unleashed a whole series of forces that are now in play.
But I certainly think with what we're experiencing here in Southeast Queensland, I think from a timing perspective, and I love what you said about it's not just timing the market. A lot of people try to time, it's actually time in the market, not just time in the market. Property is not a get rich quick. No. It's great that we're seeing clients make really good growth right now because we're in that phase, but it's also about, which you talked about earlier, is future-proofing that investment. And that's something that we're always talking about is, sometimes things can happen and markets can change with world events or whatever it might be. And so it's about ensuring that we're going into that area of where there's always going to be demand, where there's limited supply, and particularly surrounded by lots of owner-occupiers, not just every house is an investor, because that's which creates an issue there. But those markets within markets are such an important part, and I guess that's part of your analysis when you're looking at areas. You're not just looking at Australia as a whole, or Queensland as a whole, or even Southeast Queensland as a whole. There are certain areas that we see might outperform other areas based on what's happening in that locality.
Yeah, so media will tell us Sydney property prices have risen 10% in the last 12 months. I mean, Sydney, they talk about Sydney as a single market when you've got Manly versus Campbelltown and you've got Penrith versus Wallara. I mean, how could markets possibly be any more different than those kinds of...
A classic example is a property we bought years ago in Nudgee. In fact, there was a client, we actually presented to a client first, they weren't too sure, so who was my bank manager at the time. So we ended up buying it ourselves, because if it's good enough for a client, it's good enough for me. And just probably 12 months after we bought it, we had the floods in Brisbane. And that did see prices across Brisbane drop around about 4% was the average Brisbane property crashed by 4%. We actually got our house valued probably about 2 months after that because we were then utilising equity to go into some other property. It actually gone up 16% in value. And so as identifying, and I use that as an example to say, I understand you can't look at the whole market. You've got to identify those little spots.
And I think this is sometimes where, you know, some of the experts are saying there's doom and gloom, but they're not taking a look at the specific areas like maybe the Sunshine Coast. And it's, you know, Sydney might not perform different to Melbourne. They all perform differently. But sometimes these unsophisticated investors listen to those commentators and they say it's doom and gloom, where property's going to drop, but they're not looking at the individual areas. They're not looking on a macro level. You know what I mean?